All right. Thank everybody for being here. So this is a keynote talk, but also a question and answer all the way through. So I'll be asking you guys questions, and then you guys can ask me questions. So the first question is 1,000 points extra credit if anybody can name that song. Nas is like, okay, perfect, 1,000 points. So you can tune out for the rest of this talk if you want to. You've already achieved what we needed to achieve. But I bring that song just as a way to go back to like me coming up in 90s hip hop, as was mentioned in my bio, but also realizing like when I have like a lot of thoughts, or if my brain, which refuses to organize things, needs to organize a thing, the first thing that I go to, being a student of hip hop, but also somebody that writes a lot and lyrics a lot, thinks about one of the main tenets of hip hop lyrics as metaphors and similes. So Nas's Like is the name of the song, pretty much emphasizes like this connection between like rap lyrics and similes and metaphor. So that's all we needed to know, but also I had to like think about a way to organize this talk. So we're gonna go through some similes, some metaphors of design and design justice in kind of hopes of thinking about like tone setting for the rest of this week. And using these not as models, because like all of my similes and metaphors fall apart at some point, but as long as you can like suspend your disbelief for a little bit as we go through some of these examples and what I'm talking about, then we'll be cool. So traditional design is like a line, which I guess rhymes because I never said this out loud. So And so we're going to go through like this concept of a line to describe what I call traditional design, and to give that a definition, I like to think about like mediated design, how we understand it through media, through TV shows, through magazines, through the way it's primarily through education. And me coming as a graphic designer, thinking about like graphic design, product design as an example of like more of a broader sense of like how design behaves and operates in the world, and knowing that it is not exclusive to just those forms of design. So the line. So next question, what are, I would say, the qualities or like the extols of like a line that we can think about? Okay, connection. They definitely connect points. What else? Predictable? For sure. Okay, yes. What else? Straight. So straight. Yep. What else? Easy to follow. Hold on. What was said back there? Okay, what was said up here? Easy to follow. Easy to follow. I think it's easy to follow, but it also can change shapes. It's not always straight. Yeah, and so it is also straight and can be malleable. And then, if we take like the mathematic definition of a line a lot of times, right, then we're talking about something that is often straight. A couple more. Think about like, what does a line do, or what does a line symbolize? Separation. Okay, separation. And I would add like borders of things, or perimeters, right? What else? Directional, for sure. Okay. And so let me just add like a couple more, if you agree or not. But a lot of times like lines can symbolize like elegance, right, at times, right, and this idea of like simplicity, and so cool. So we're also going to talk about design in these terms. And I'm also putting this box around this because it symbolizes a frame that will become important. So to me, this is traditional design in a lot of ways, symbolizes it. It is a frame around a line that goes from one point to another point. And the other reason why I bring up lines, because of its connection and tethering to things, which we'll come back to, but I didn't make this up. Just as like a Google search, lines are very efficient in explaining design process in general, and has been that way for a while. And so one that will, or there are two up there that are kind of like really simple or very similar are, let me see if I can use this. Okay, I don't know if we can see my pointer on this thing. Never mind. Okay, so the squiggly line going to the straight line, right? So this emphasizes like a problem that goes to a solution, right? From a messy brain to a clear brain, or a messy problem to something that has been straightened out by the designer and the design process. And I think that metaphor, which I didn't make up, is pretty much what I'm going to talk about, or this example. So we brought up this idea of direction, right? So with design, it is directional. In the way that we kind of understand time moves from one place to another within design process, right? There's a beginning moving towards an end, but also thinking about this idea of progress and pushing things forward. We're connecting 2 points, right? It's been brought up where a beginning, a middle, and an end when we get to when we're talking about design process. But also, how do we know design was done well, right? Usually we'll get this based on sales, based on time spent engaging with a thing, views, whatever, right? We're talking about an upward increase, an incline, or whatever. So just these things. So just going back, this idea of traditional design, I would argue, comes very specifically from this idea of industry. And there's hardly a way to separate design, especially when I'm talking about graphic design, product design. It has been the right arm of industry and the right unquestioning arm of industry in a lot of ways. So it comes from industry, and if we start the other thing I just wanted to talk about, so in this talk, right, with my metaphors, and maybe in the question and answer, if we get into it, if we, we're doing the thing if we get really punny, right, with some of these ideas. So we'll have fun with this. But this tie to industry, which we'll, talk a little bit later, one of the puns, or this idea of this connection, right, we understand production lines, right, that have come out of industry, but also have driven, no pun intended, design, right? Also streamlining of things. So not just process or waste, but we're also talking about streamlining of the things that were created. So if we were to talk about, in my profession, typography has been streamlined over the years, but we're also talking about cars, right? Cars have streamlined. If we talk about phones have become a line, right? If we're talking about the getting to it. But also, being born out of industry, design has grown industry immensely, right? And so there's an inextricable link between design progress and the progress of industry. And I'm not here to try to prove that, but this is where we are in a lot of ways. So So as we move forward, and I'm talking about like traditional design, there have been other metaphors to think about design process where, you know what, design is not so linear. Let's meander that line a little bit, right? Just so we can understand that, like, maybe we're not just purely linear thinkers in doing this. And so recently it's kind of done this in certain design models, and even this. And so I'm not even really trying to explain what these things are. We can get to it later, like maybe what some of these models are. But just know that people are telling you, like, this is what we do when we design. We're not linear thinkers, right? We move around, and sometimes we return to the beginning of the process and think about it cyclically. But I would say in all of those models, this has never happened. The tether to industry has never been investigated, it's never been interrogated, it's never actually been just called out. And so the reason why I think this is important, because we'll get into a story of another type of line, this line. So, and this goes into a personal story as well. But this leads up into a time maybe 10 years ago when I was in grad school getting an MFA in visual design, 2D design at a small weird school called Cranbrook, and it's in the suburbs of Detroit in Michigan. But I started to notice this thing, design for good, and people really thinking about, like, how do we use design to not just work towards industry or to grow industry. And I'm not saying this is the first time in history that this has happened, but I started to notice this as becoming very popular and the thing that people really started to become interested in. And I'm going to go back to, like, this idea of a line. Design connected with industry does a really good job, right, at industry. It's like the process has been molded, it's been refined. It does an amazing job at doing that. But I would say 10 years ago, and this is also an origin story for, say, Design Justice, which is not just for me, we found that there were a lot of people becoming frustrated with design in trying to be helpful or design for good or design interacting with communities. And I would say is because, like, this process does not address key things. It just addresses industry, but I would say people trained in these methodologies saw the success that they had in industry and thought that they could immediately be grafted onto communities, which I think was a major fault in logic, in trying to get some results. So this line, so Cranbrook was this weird place where, as designers, actually wanted to see the line do this. And to me, what this represents is it's antagonistic to traditional designers, because traditional designers do not like things out of place. People at Cranbrook like everything out of place, but it still has this tether back to industry, so we'll talk about that. It's still never interrogated, like, its connection, but for me, this kind of shaking things up, this unpredictability that we talked about earlier, creates the illusion, and sometimes in a real way, this idea of, like, more possibilities that can come out of the process. And so it wants to stay in this realm in order to generate possibilities. So that was me doing stuff on campus. And so, like, my time, which is not really, I don't think it's that important what I was doing, but a lot of the stuff that I was doing is I was, like, kind of LARPing as a designer. And so, like, my role or my assumed position was, like, I was a designer for the future, and the future was my client. And so I play acted that the entire time I was there. And so I thought about like the future as a product, not even a product, but an industry that had many different lines. So if like, you know, Coke had Coke Zero, Classic Coke or whatever, the future had also different brands within it, whether they be apocalyptic, utopian, you know, like uneventful, boring, whatever futures. I was the main art director for the future. Okay, so it was also important when I was going at this time was we were in post racial euphoria. This was the second election of Barack Obama. And so I think this was really important because like racism had been solved at this point. And it was very apparent in art schools at this time when you tried to make work about race or politics, where a lot of times you were a throwback to the 60s. You were actually referencing old styles, old thoughts, or whatever. And so, yeah, this euphoria made it really difficult for me to talk about what I really wanted to talk about in art school. And I could see that amongst my classmates. When they wanted to talk about it, they were met with a lot of resistance to be like, well, you know, who do you think you are, Angela Davis or whatever? And that was like the connection when people tried to like make a reference when they tried to talk about it intelligently. Also, I'm gonna skip a couple slides and come back. It was an important time because it was, and once again, we're leading up to the time of design justice coming together and forming some of these thoughts. It was prior to the murder of Trayvon Martin. And so in this sliver of time, we'll get to another metaphor, which I'm just skipping forward, so sorry. And we'll come back as a preview. So design like a design project, or sorry, where's design? Okay, so design is like a design project. And so design was really at this time trying to figure out what it wanted to do and where it wanted to go. But there was no justice lens that was really being pushed in the discourse at this time. Because remember, we're still in post-racial euphoria, right? And so there were, I'm about to jump back, sorry. But right, we're not linear, right? So, I would go to like a lot of conferences and summits and things like that, and this would be the main provocation, right? You would go somewhere and people were like, how do we have engagement? How do we interact with people? Well, let's ask people what design is. And like a lot of times you would have a name tag, you would have a poster or whatever, and you would fill in design is, once again, like that line, right? But I would like start to get really sick of this trope because it was like everywhere, and I was like, well, why do people think like this is engagement or deeply trying to figure things out? But I had to translate like being upset with this because actually design was trying to redesign itself at this moment. My problem was the answers. And so they would always hold very closely to like concepts of design is very, I don't know, like just easy answers. Design is like minimalism, or design is, you know, my car. I'm just making up like weird, this random like examples, but none of them like really hit hard, right? So I think it was asking for what could design be. And not until after the murder of Trayvon Martin did people actually start to think about justice across a lot of different, like, you know, places in this country, but in design very particularly, we could start to think about what design could actually do. Okay, and so in design school, also I was like working on a project with my collective complex movement. So who's familiar with this quote, right? For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? So question, just follow up for this this quote, who like really resonated with this quote when they heard it, or when they were first, you know, exposed to Audre Lorde's words, right? So they hit me like a ton of bricks, right? So also, like, and I don't know if anybody else had like a reaction, especially as a practicing designer, but this was my reaction, right? When I actually started to internalize that statement. Where was a place where the master's tools did not exist, right? So it paralyzed me in my ability to make or move forward with, you know, with this. And so, and I don't know, Audre Lorde's words really had me thinking about like, well, how can I apply that statement to my practice? And like I said, when I answered it, I was like, well, I can't really do anything because everything is a master tool. Adobe's Photoshop, if I'm trying to like do type design, if I'm even trying to use typography, if I'm using Helvetica, that's the master's tools, right? If so kind of being stuck, but also with my collective, which this is my collective complex movements, there was another set of words or wisdom that was coming through. And so, does anybody know who this is? Okay. The great Wesley Boggs, who lived to be 100 years and 100 days, and was also mentoring us as we were making a specific project. And so we had the good fortune of being inspired by her thinking and her philosophy, but also engaging with her as we started to build work. And so what was really important were a lot of the tools that she was giving us. And one of the main tools Grace was thinking about at the time was how complexity and movement building combine, and complexity science, complexity thinking, and to paraphrase, which is a whole nother talk, she was thinking about these ideas of another metaphor of Newtonian movement building to what she would call like quantum movement building. And one of the main metaphors that we brought out of that larger metaphor was critical connections over critical mass. And so this idea of interconnectedness, this idea of just being able to do things in smaller but deeper relationship organizations and models. So that was Grace helping me move forward where Audre Lorde like hit me like a ton of bricks. So we'll kind of talk about this. Was like, I was having fun like making models with lines. So like as an aside, I was like, this is like how design used to want to be. And I guess this is just like a straight up aside. And this will also lead us into another point, but this is like, I feel like current startup design model, right? Move fast, break things. It's the laser beam that does all of that, right? So we'll come back to that. Okay, so next question. What does this line signify? Exponential growth, right? What are some other associative words that we can think about this line? Progress, okay. Trends. Relationships, how?
Between two variables.
Okay. What else? Wait, oh, sorry. Start here. Profit, okay. Curve, okay. What else?
Two-dimensional.
Huh?
Two-dimensional.
Two-dimensional, okay.
Flat.
Flat. Fast, okay. Success, okay. Let's just keep a couple more.
Hockey stick.
You said hockey stick, no doubt. That's definitely an association. Pandemic. What? Okay, a mountain. Okay. Yeah, I mean, those are like definitely good like associative words. Here's some more that I think about when I see this line. So these are my associations, right? Greed, exploitation, acceleration, the compression of time and place or time and space, progress with another S, event horizons, but also urgency, right? I think this is what it, these are my associations with that line. But also, right, I think the reason why I'm talking about this line, because I would say, going back to what I was talking about earlier, is like this is job well done for design process, especially today, especially if we're talking about the economies that we're talking about that design attaches itself to. There's also, I feel like, when I speak about this idea of urgency, right, I have this question of whose urgency, and I'm thinking about another concept of a gift, and who is this a gift to, this line, if it's achieved?
Whoever drew the line.
Huh?
Whoever drew the line.
Well, I mean, I drew the line. Did I benefit? Yeah, so like companies, employees, designers. Yeah, I would say do employees really see see the benefit of this line usually?
Investors.
Investors definitely see the benefit of this line. We're trying to get to that. In general, and just thinking about, once again, this right here is like, once we got to this model, that line becomes way more present and prevalent in design, where what we're trying to achieve. But also, like, this urgency, I realize is like not my urgency, and so I'm thinking about like whose urgency is that we adopt, trying to get to this line. But also thinking about, in design, as designers, we do a good job of willfully ignoring, on the other side, masking or covering what it takes to actually get to that line, like what is withdrawn from to get there. And as designers, right, in order to go from 100 in shoe sales to 10,000 in shoe sales in a matter of 3 months or whatever, right, we mask the amount of resources that go into that, right, as part of the design process. So, another set of lines. And still we're getting into this point of design justice. And thinking about like this idea of like design for a good, which was prevalent at my time during grad school, I think my frustration, what I started to understand, was a lot of other people's frustration. Because people were, once again, grafting this thing that worked really well for industry onto communities and was causing harm across the board when people realized, like, why aren't we getting the results that we want when we're trying to fix the problems of broken people, broken communities, or people that are not seeing the benefit of that exponential curve. And so there's this, there are these people that don't get referenced. And so in traditional design, you look towards like the great designers as the rule makers and the heroes. And I would say design justice, people moving and leading into this who didn't have words for this, but were thinking about new context, didn't think about the line, they were thinking about the grid. And once again, the grid is another trope in design, but it's an invisible grid that I think of Patricia Hill Collins in her theory of the matrix of domination in society. So we have a grid. It's not the line, but I think Patricia Hill Collins was saying life in our society does not operate on that curve. It operates closer to this thing. And so the first move of pulling that tether from industry for design justice folks is reattaching and this line or this tether from industry to the thinking of these people in order to move into communities and potentially do better jobs than Design for Good was doing at that time. So the exponential line being the symbol for good work for a designer. For, I would say, these people, this would be the symbol for good work. This, or, you know, just blowing it up, right? So going away from the exponential curve to this idea of a net, right? So we're moving, once again, we're still in 2D space. Like if I started thinking about 3D space, then this would be an 8-hour talk and like whatever. So I'm trying to keep it, you know, in this plane. But this is like the metaphor that I'm thinking about as we move forward with design and thinking about when we say good job, is this being created at the end or as a result of or during the process of design as like an ongoing continuous thing. So design justice also is like a guidepost, which I don't really have slides for, but I would say when design justice is doing its job, it's pointing to other things. So for instance, the work and the thinking of Audre Lorde, Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, right? And going back to what Sasha was saying, moving forward with bravery, right? These are also the founding people of the boogie term CRT, right? So you have to, when you attach your ideas to this thinking, you have to be brave in these days. So, but I also think that they think about accountability as being a gift. And this is another like simile, which I think this is where design justice operates, is it brings about accountability into the process, but it also can be put forward as a gift. So instead of the threat of CRT, I would say their thinking is actually a gift to society. Because if we adopt this thinking, we get this, right? Which is the whole thing. Not an exponential curve, which I feel like this is a gift for society. The exponential curve is a gift for the people we already know as the 0.1% or the 1%. So these are the words of Bell Hooks. How do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed? So just using that as context. Okay. So when design justice is doing this thing. Also, before I move to this, I feel like this is the design project that the Design Justice Network is engaged with right now. So if we were to talk about like who is Design Justice Network, if we were to talk to the steering committee, myself, Sasha, the rest of the team, we are looking to create this as designers for our network. And we've been faced with a lot of those lines. We've seen different levels of growth. We've seen pains from that, but we've also tried our best to resist growth when we talk about, say, membership or things like that. because there would be one benefit if we were to see exponential growth within our membership, but we wouldn't be serving the people really engaged in these ideas well. So we've had to get rid of those lines and that line thinking in order to really do what we say we want, that we're trying to do out into the world. Okay, so design justice, like this scene in this movie.
Good morning. How can I help you?
I'm just checking out these artifacts. You're telling me you're an expert.
You could say that.
They're beautiful. Where's this one from?
The Bobo Ashanti tribe, present-day Ghana, 19th century.
Right. And what about this one?
That's from the Edo people of Benin, 16th century.
Now, tell me about this one.
Also from Benin, 7th century, in Fula tribe, I believe.
Nah.
I beg your pardon.
It was taken by British soldiers in Benin, but it's from Wakanda, and it's made out of vibranium. Don't trip. I'm gonna take it off your hands for you.
These items aren't for sale.
How do you think your ancestors got these? You think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?
Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
We got all this security in here watching me ever since I walked in, but you ain't checking for what you put in your body.
All right, mate. Let's have it. Come on, mate. Time.
I think she might not be feeling too good. Hey, if somebody needs some help, come here. Call the doctor. I'm leaving. Hey, please, somebody, help.
Emergency right away. The West African exhibit, please. Right away.
Step back, please. Step back.
I'm going to take a break.
Let's get the ladies some space, please.
Step back, please, gents. Step back, please.
Hey, come here. Come here, come here. Tuck in. You can go, but just don't tell anyone, all right? Bro, why you ain't just shooting right here?
Because it's better to leave the crime scene more spread out. Makes us look like amateurs.
Now then, let's see if you know what you're talking about. It's just a taste. You're gonna be a rich boy.
Better sell that quick.
Yeah, it's already sold.
Whatever you try, them condoms will probably show up.
Well, that'll make my day. I can kill two birds with one stone. You're not telling me that's vibranium too?
All right, so the reason why I bring in science fiction into all of this is because also, like, I'm so desensitized to like media violence. I should have done a trigger warning, so I apologize. Science fiction, I think, is important. Once again, it's not like a perfect metaphor, but I would say if Black Panther was made prior, in the sliver between the second election of Barack Obama prior to the murder of Trayvon Martin, then this whole movie would have been about the bureaucracy of returning a piece of artwork back to the place where it was sourced. And we would have a whole 2.5-hour movie about government and policy and things like that, right? Post Trayvon Martin, I would say, is when you have a movie such as like Black Panther that kind of cuts to the chase, right? And I would say in design, when we were talking about design for good, or when design was in its redesign era, we would still be going back and forth about policy, bureaucracy. Are these things even important? And so we would not, I would doubt we would be having this conversation now, or the conversations, or the collective of design justice coming together, because I think there was a group of people that was sick of people circumnavigating this idea of race and harm. And I would say an important thing when I think about design, as a designer, I think about myself as part of the tribe, in implicating ourselves in all of these systems, right? Before design training, designers were seen as outside of, or agents of. And so I think one important aspect of design justice is understanding that we are implicated in a lot of these systems. And so how much time do we want to spend on certain aspects of, like, the pre-Death of Trayvon Martin movie, or the one where we've seen based on these movements for, you know, lives and Black lives, and all kinds of other harms and injustices that came to the forefront in that moment. So I have other metaphors that, but I'm going to leave it here for questions and answers, and maybe a brief moment. And how much time will we have?
Maybe like 10 more minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. So questions, and if anything comes relevant, maybe I might have slides to address that. So, any questions?
And that we have a mic. I'll just get it for whoever would like to ask. Well, thank you so much for your very thought-provoking, metaphor-filled talk, and I appreciate the non-linearity of it. Yeah, so any questions? And we'll pass you the mic.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the beginnings of the Design Justice Network and how it fit into this kind of timeline that you've laid out.
Yeah. So in 2015, there's an event that happens in Detroit at the time every year called the Allied Media Conference. And at the Allied Media Conference is a convening of a lot of people that think about media and social movement building across a lot of different disciplines in media and things like that. So I think the interesting thing about, like, the AMC is the intersections that end up happening. And so it roots itself, I would say, in Kimberly Crenshaw's philosophy of, like, intersectionality, where you would have librarians who would think about media and media justice and movement building, but it wouldn't be just librarians. It would be, right, fem goth librarians, and then they would find their whole group of people and convene in Detroit, and it would be all of these intersectional ways of media and movement making that had specificity, but also, like, address things that would not address unless we talked about it in an intersectional way. So in 2015, there was a design section of it, and it was called the Future Design Lab, I think, organized by a few colleagues, Nina Bianchi, Una Lee, and a couple other people, Jenny Lee. And there was one section, it was a breakout section that was design justice, and it was, they used the words, but creating the principles for design justice. There were no hashtags at that time they were just thinking about these ideas, and then I was kind of brought in to help facilitate that session. But in that room, there were urban planners, there were architects, there were organizers, there were graphic designers, there were urban farmers, all in this room. And what we did was we basically looked at design for good projects in the city of Detroit that on the surface looked like they were doing benefit to a community. And we did what we called a harm benefit analysis to those projects. And what we asked was who was involved, who benefited, and who was harmed. And in the group, we assessed all these things in this Venn diagram of those 3 sections and kind of plotted these projects. And our finding in that session with that group of people, when we saw harm in all of these projects, in what was going on, and we really saw the designer as benefiting the most out of all of those projects. But we also saw communities being harmed by how they were being portrayed, how the ownership of the story that they had, or lack of ownership of the story that they had, or even the project. And so we came up with a much larger group of like principles to see how can we avoid these outcomes if we see these as being harmful in this group. And so maybe it was like we had 20 or so like ideas to principles to think about how this could not happen or be repeated. And over the course of a year, we edited these down to 10. And so many people in that room stayed with it, new people came in, and then the next AMC we convened, and we put all the principles that we had at play on the wall and kind of like refined them down to the 10 that we have now. So, and I was saying, like, once again, I think it was a lot of people that came into this room because they saw what this idea of like what design not connected to these principles of like the philosophers that I was putting up there was doing the community. So it wasn't me. I think it was like a lot of people who saw this disconnect and principles that needed to be applied. And you know, at that time, like if you did a Google search for principles for design, they would all be formal, right? And they would all very much be specific to graphic design. Actually, if you did principles of design, it would be line, color, form, contrast, you know, balance, symmetry, right? And so they just all spoke to this idea of form. And I think design was also doing a really good job of pulling, I think, in a very broad sense, politics out of it in order to, like, I think, achieve, like, different things, which I think a lot of these things are seen as inconvenience, right? When the line is crooked, then you're dealing with, like, a lot of inconvenient factors in the process. And so also hearkening back to politics in design, which are all there, like if we were to get to another part, like thinking about style as politics, and in these events where the design is like thing, when people were provoked, they would actually go back to the 50s and 60s as like what was true and pure about design. And I would say, thinking about like manifestos within design and artwork at that time were really lacking at that moment, which I think prior there were a lot of manifestos and a lot of rules and a lot of hidden rules and agenda that weren't brought to the forefront at that time. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ben. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about this business of paralysis and you know, moving beyond it, working with students in design, pedagogy. It seems like we're constantly walking the line of not arriving in paralysis, knowing that we are nowhere near where we want to be, and we have to sort of live what we can live right now, and you know, students aren't one thing. They're a great diverse set of people, and some are in one place in all of this, and some are completely another, and some are in full shutdown, and some are like, you're not doing enough. that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there are a couple questions. One of my really good colleagues and good friends, Nancy Kalelo Mutiti, who I've taught with, is now the chair of graphic design at Yale. When people would get met with this paralysis, she would actually ask the question like, why do you have to make anything? Or is it actually your position not to make something at this moment, right? And sitting with that paralysis as being maybe an indictment of your position in society, and should you be making? That's one question. As it can be really provocative for somebody spending a lot of time or a lot of money in going to this to get skills and to go out and do your thing in the world as a designer or maker or whatever. But I also think when I reached that paralysis, there were, once again, I think other bits of information that were feeding me that I thought were being sourced outside of this this master's house, right? Or people were trying and reaching and tethering themselves to ideas and tools that were not the master's, and they had been thinking about these things for way longer than me. And I think introducing multiple perspectives in that way can help guide somebody out of that paralysis.
I was going to say, I think we're about time for questions, but...
Can we do one more question?
Sure.
Please.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering, how are you teaching these principles to your students as a professor?
Yeah, there are many ways. So a lot of times I will bring in different people that I think embody some of these principles. But I also think the quick way to answer it is, there's a paralysis, once again, with these principles when you try to think about them, holding all 10 of them at once, and making that the checklist of success. A lot of times I encourage people to pick one and see if that works. And then if you can build that, but still, I don't see many scenarios where all 10 of those things are working on full tilt, right? And so I think bite-sized chunks of the principles and using that as a guide is a way, I think, better way to move forward with them. And that's the way I've come up with now. And I probably will come up with different solutions later on.
Awesome. Thanks. If we can give one more thank you.